have a special privilege to have John Tubasing here tonight to talk to us about the topic of business as calling and business as missions. And John worked for many years in the business world, has a BS degree in marketing and an MBA in international business, and served in the private sector in a number of different ways. He'll tell you a little bit about that. He's also a deacon, has been a deacon and an elder at his church in St. Louis, Kirk of the Hills, and is now working for Mission to the World in extending the church's work around the world, seeing business as a tool for missions and employing and deploying skilled people for the purpose of advancing the work of Christ in the world. So, John, thank you for coming tonight. Come on up now. We have John Hutchison coming in this weekend. He was supposed to be here tonight as well. The snowstorm grounded his plane in D.C. We're praying that he would arrive, and our pastor's conference has another speaker from New York City on Fridays. But we're glad that you got out of St. Louis and got here, and look forward to you sharing with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, George, and whoever else had to approve me being your speaker this evening. It is a great privilege to be here. I wanted to make sure I fit in, so I called Jackie before I left to make sure that I would dress appropriately. I don't know if you saw George walk in, but nothing else, I got that right. Before I forget, greetings from the state of Missouri, the home of that university that thinks it's a powerhouse in the SEC. I don't know what we were thinking. We prayed twice. I'm going to assume third time's a charm. Join me, will you? Father, I pray that you would close the ears of these good people to anything that I say that may be contrary to the gospel or that may convey that we can earn somehow by what we do your love. Father, I pray that you would help us all leave here this evening as a result of being together more knowledgeable and more knowledgeable of your love and more in love with you and more committed to your mission here on earth. And I pray this in Christ's name. Amen. So what do you do? I've answered that question a lot, and it's changed a lot over the years. I've always had my fare of airplane travel. And so when I travel, I get asked that question some by the person that's sitting in the row alongside of me. 9 years ago, I left, as Mike said, the corporate world and joined Mission to the World. It wasn't an easy decision or easy transition, but I'm glad I did it, and I really do believe that I was and am called to it. I hope you feel that way about what you're doing. By the way, I believe most people should kind of bloom where they're planted, and so I'm not here to try and get you all to think that you need to move overseas and join and become a missionary or go to work for a church. On the other hand, in a group this size, there probably are some of you who God may be calling to do that. Back to being asked what I do. I now say when people ask me that, well, I help people in developing countries start businesses. And then I pause, and the response is usually kind of a positive, oh, really? But then I go on and I say, and I raise money for the church over there. And then they go, oh. That kind of ends the conversation. So let me ask you, what do you do? Why do you do it? And are you called to it? We'll address those questions, okay? But first of all, let me tell you a couple things I think you ought to know about myself. I love business. I'm not in it anymore, but I still love it. It was my first career for 30 years, and you could sum up my experience by saying I was hired several times, I've been promoted several times, I've been fired, I've been laid off. I started my own little company, and it had some success for a couple of years, and then it failed miserably. So I've kind of experienced a lot of business, and I am an unapologetic capitalist and believer in the free enterprise system. I happen to think that business is the second most transformative agent in the world. The first is the church, way far ahead of anything else. Why do I say that about business? Because There's more people involved in business and commerce than anything else in the world. And if the Christians can influence the business community, that's a good thing for any country. The other is because it funds most everything else. So it's a very transformative agent in the world. Matt Ridley, in his book, The Rational Optimist, extols the critical part business and commerce have played in history when he says his research on the progress of countries proves that where commerce thrives, even creativity and compassion both flourish. Think about that, it makes a lot of sense. And that's written by a man who is certainly not a Christian, in fact, an evolutionary zoologist, who nevertheless is optimistic about our future and has written some things that most of us would surprisingly agree with. This is a little bit off topic, but I have to say anyhow. He's got a phrase in there that I love. He says, most people look at history through rose-colored glasses and look to the future through gray ones. Now, he would never say this, but we know as Christians, if anything, it should be the opposite. We should be the most optimistic people about our future. Here's another quote by someone many of us may not normally align with. Bono, the lead singer of the rock band U2, has devoted a lot to trying to arrest poverty and disease in Africa. Said recently, a humbling thing for me was to realize the importance of capitalism and entrepreneurialism in philanthropy, particularly as someone who has got into this as a righteous anger activist with all the cliches. He went on to say, job creators and innovators are the key, and aid is just a bridge. A humbling thing was to learn the role of commerce. That is quite an endorsement for business as mission around the world. Before I go any further, let me say that while I'm going to talk about business as a calling and business as mission, practically everything I say applies to other professions and vocations, so I hope you can make the translation. Here's the second thing you should know about me. I love Jesus, I love the church, and I love the local church. I think the local church is the key to transformation, because any other transformation will drift away if it's not rooted in the church. I also believe pastors and pastorally trained missionaries are very uniquely gifted and have a unique role. My son is a PCA pastor. So while I'm going to talk about the importance of business as a calling and business as missions and the important role business people should and can play, I very much have a high regard for our pastors and our pastoral missionaries. I want to start with this verse, 1 Peter, because it starts with and ends with grace. I also like this verse because it calls us to be using our gifts to serve one another. And finally, I like this verse because it talks about stewardship. And I have come to believe that stewardship is one of those keys to life. If we get stewardship right, we get a lot of life right. And so I hope that I'm able to encourage you this evening to be faithful stewards of the way God has designed you. And for many of you, that's as business people. I want to challenge and encourage you in two areas. One, business as a calling. And with that, we're going to talk about the biblical basis for business being a calling. We'll look at a picture of what it can look like, and I'll try and give you some examples both of people who are living that way in their local community as well as around the world. We'll talk about what makes it hard to live as if business is a calling. And I'll share a few principles to work by, not to live by, but to work by. And here I really want to target these to younger people who may not be business owners or people with a lot of influence, because it's harder sometimes to live out business as a calling for those of you in that kind of position. And then we'll talk about business as mission. If you can read this, this is a list of people from the Bible. I've selected these people because their vocations either are as business people or close to it. Now, I know, a couple of them are funny, aren't they? And I smile too. But I really want you to take this seriously, because I didn't. I would read my Bible and I'd hear about these people. I never really thought they had jobs, that they worked really hard at it, and that they were called to them. But I believe they were, and I believe God used them very mightily to fulfill his kingdom. Jesus, for 30 of his 33 years, was a carpenter. He most likely worked for a profit-making businessman, his father. Peter, James, and John were not recreational fishermen. They weren't small-time fishermen. By the size of their boats, they were commercial fishermen. And some would say if they ever left fishing, even during the time they were walking with Jesus, they certainly came back to being fishermen. Lydia was not the kind of person who made the stuff you'd buy at the Salvation Army. She traded and made expensive clothing and bankrolled the early church to some degree. So each of these people had a vocation, and they took it serious. In the interest of time, I'm just going to trust you get the idea that business can be a calling. I know Mike Heron has had a class with the young people. I've looked at his PowerPoints. It's a great class. I hope you're going to repeat it. And if you have questions about whether business is a calling, you can see Mike. But we'll move on. But here's the problem. We don't live that way, and I didn't live as if it was a calling for most of my 30 years in the business world. And why is that? Well, we have other voices that speak to us. Some of those voices are from the movies. This is Michael Douglas, but in this movie, he went by another name. Do you know what that name was? Gordon Gekko in the film The Wall Street. He epitomized money and power. Now, there's nothing wrong with money and power. Those are good things, but like anything pushed to an extreme, they become a bad thing. But a lot of us get caught up, and business can be seductive because it can involve a lot of money. TV is another source of a bad voice or a bad message. Now, we all laugh with Michael and his sales team, but there's a subtle message there to business people. It's, we'll just get by, and there couldn't possibly be anything redeeming about work. Fortunately, there are people who live out business as a calling. And I want to show you a little bit of a video that will depict maybe the goal that we should strive for and does a good job of explaining what that would look like. And I think I have to press this a second time and it'll play.
Work. Most of us spend over half our lives at work. Whatever it is you fill the 9 to 5 with, planting crops, building cars, taking care of patients, teaching students, or running a business, work is where most of life happens. For some, work is a drain. They dread Monday mornings, forcing themselves to struggle through because they need the paycheck, while many times feeling trapped and beaten down by their job. Some people love their work. They're good at what they do. It energizes them. It's a place of security, a place to chase dreams, desires, and success. At work, they find fulfillment. We often forget to connect our faith to our work. We don't consider the reasons God may have us at our job. We don't think about the purpose and meaning we could bring to our work. We simply focus on how it makes us feel. But what if we saw our work as an opportunity to worship? As Christians, we are called to serve Christ with our lives. For a few, that means working as a pastor, a youth minister, or a missionary. Others serve the church by teaching children or singing in the choir. But when Sunday is over, most of us return to our jobs outside the church. For us, our mission is in the marketplace. We may not be the kind of missionary who moves to the far regions of Africa, but around the conference table, around the water cooler, around the cubicle, we have an opportunity to worship the God who created us. He gave us skill. He gave us passion. He gave us work. When we do our jobs with excellence and integrity and diligence, it's an act of worship. We are displaying God's craftsmanship to the non-believing world around us. We are earning the right to be heard. We don't see a divide between Sunday and Monday, between the sacred and the secular. We've been invited into parts of the world that a pastor or traditional missionary will never see. We have conversations with people who would never set foot in a church. Whether we love or dread our work, we choose to turn the focus away from ourselves and toward the mission God has for us. church is not the only place we worship, and Sundays are not the only days on our calendars that have meaning. Every day on mission for God brings us great joy. Like the heroes before us, we can be modern-day Noahs and Josephs and Peters who are called with a purpose. God has designed us. He created us to work and to worship. For us, work is worship.
That's really amazing that they can do that, isn't it? And doesn't that help you learn and capture it? I worked with a global management consulting firm, and we had centers around the world. We'd bring management teams from big companies in to do planning and problem solving, and we would employ those people on whiteboards that while a group was talking, they were up there recording what was said. And it's amazing how effective that is. But that's not why I showed it to you. I hope you like the message. I want to use this diagram to do a couple things. Business's mission is a term that most generally applies to working overseas. Some people use it to encompass all kinds of business as ministry. But I'm going to submit that most people use business's mission to talk about there. I want to talk about here. What does business as a calling look like right here in Augusta? And I'll use some of the terms here, or I'll define them, and then give you some examples of people I know that are living out their business life like that video depicts. Faith at work is a term that's used to describe helping people live out their faith at their work, generally confined to their own place of employment within their own four walls. Marketplace ministry then is a term that would describe living out your faith in the broader marketplace with your customers, your suppliers, your community. But there's a lot of overlap between those two. This goes back probably 3 years ago. At that time, there were over 1,200 ministries just in the United States focused on faith at work and marketplace ministry. Some of them you've undoubtedly heard of, CBMC, C12, FCCI, Christ at Work, the Faith at Work Center at LeTourneau University, our friends at Redeemer Presbyterian in New York City who are going to be joining us later. I think what they do would fit within this Faith at Work marketplace ministry idea. And I would encourage you to get involved in one of those local ministries if any of them operate here, because it can really be helpful to helping us grow out or live out our business as a calling. So let me give you some examples. Strategic resource ministry. This is a term I came up with, so it'll have a shelf life of probably end tomorrow, but I use it to refer to people who have the gift of wealth creation. Most people don't talk about that, and I think that's sad. Wealth is a good thing. It can be used for great purposes, and certain people just seem to have the gift or ability to create wealth. Not just earn a living, but create wealth. And we should be encouraging them and helping them with that. Because I think, personally, I don't have a biblical basis for saying this, but it just seems to make sense to me that if somebody has the gift or the ability of wealth creation, they must have the gift of generosity. Otherwise, I don't know why they'd have that. And guess what? I think most of us are wealthy, comparatively, so we must have the gift of generosity. The problem is we haven't been told how to develop that and helped with that. So I want to give you some examples of people who are using that gift wisely. Okay, here you go, Jack. And as I do this, think about, could you see yourself doing some of these things? Jack is a business owner. He has about a dozen employees. He struggles to meet payroll. This isn't a wildly successful business, nor a wealthy man. But he employs 3 men from Africa from his local community. Why? Because they're really good workers, but also as a witness to the rest of his team and to help impact the community. Don is a car dealer. He noticed that minorities would come in to buy a car and they didn't know, and I think some of these were immigrants, refugees, and they didn't know how to negotiate. So they were paying top dollar. And he didn't feel that was right. So he set a flat price and said no more negotiation with anybody. It cost him some profits, but he felt it was the right thing to do. Tom owns a business and is heavily involved in ministry in his own town, but also in global missions. He had a chaplain at one point in time for his business. His employees are given the opportunity to help decide where to send portions of the profits, which ministries to support. And in fact, every ministry they support has an employee advocate for that ministry. Henry and a partner has a business that encourages their employees, with young children especially, to go home at 5:30, have dinner with the children and the wife or husband, put them to bed, and then if they have to work later, do that at home. And their profits haven't suffered a bit. Dave is a man who was in middle management in a company and was bothered the way the company was recording revenues, so he went to the president and asked about it and told him that. He thinks it probably cost him his job a little bit later on. Alan and his wife wanted to be missionaries, but the father had a little business and he wanted him to take it over. They prayed and thought about it, and they did. It was a very small company. One of the things they were concerned about in doing so was that if it became successful, they'd get caught up in the wealth. So what he did, he and his wife set a ceiling on their standard of living, which is pretty modest. And then they did something very important because they knew they wouldn't hold to it. They asked other people to help hold them accountable. And they've been doing this for years now. And the company grew from a very small company to where it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and they give away $1 million a month, mostly to global missions. Those are just some examples. I hope you can take something from them and employ them here in Augusta in a new, fresh way. Now, before I talk about BAM, I want to talk a little bit still on this idea of business as calling. Why is it difficult to live this kind of a life? I'm not a scholar, I'm not a theologian, so I'm just going to tell you why it was hard for me. And I don't want to stand up here and make you think that I wasn't a Christian. I was, and I had some success in my Christian life in the business world. But these were things that I struggled with. Idols. Power, pride, passion, position, materialism, fear that I wouldn't have the career that somebody else thought I should have, fear that I wouldn't provide for my family the way somebody else thought I should. And just to state the obvious, just because you go work for a church or a mission agency doesn't mean you stop struggling with idols. I'm sure your pastors would tell you that. I had long known and heard that there was no secular-sacred divide. But I'd never heard I was in full-time ministry. In fact, shortly after I joined Mission to the World, a well-intentioned person said to me, well, what is it like now to be in full-time ministry? And I thought about it, and then it bothered me, because I thought, so I just wasted 30 years of my life. And that doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, I know what they were saying. I worked hard for my church, but I did not recognize and have a full-orb view of what business as a calling was. Now, from another angle, I want to tell you, because there's a message in what I'm about to tell you. For 8 years, I've led a Bible study in my neighborhood with men in the neighborhood. A couple people have come to Christ. For several of these men, it's the only time they're in the Word. Lots of times I've wanted to stop doing this, but I haven't, because it's important. And here's why I say that. I'm not convinced my service in my church, as important as that is, I told you I'm a churchman, or my service at Mission of the World is any more important than my ministry in my neighborhood. We are all in full-time ministry, and so my suggestion to you is the next time a missionary or a pastor tells you they're in full-time ministry, you either quietly to yourself or lovingly to them say, well, I am too. The other reason I struggled for a long while, was bad theology. And by that I mean, I got the first two parts of this right. I got creation and fall. I was a sinner and I knew I needed a Savior. And I know the world had fallen and it needed something. But I didn't get the redemption and restoration. And we don't have time to get into that. We'll leave that to George and Mike and the others here. But unless you have a really fully developed view of that aspect, you won't think anything you do now has eternal consequences. But they do. And so when you get that understanding, it motivates you even more to want to live out your life and business as a calling. Finally, I minimized grace. I knew I was saved by grace, by faith alone. There was no aspect of it that was works, but I was in control, wanted to be in control, thought I could be in control. It was my career, it was my gifts, it was my talents. And not until grace penetrates you will it change what and how you do your job and plan your life. Those are just a few things that I think make it hard. I said I wanted to share some principles to work by, and I just want to highlight a few of these. First one is value your work the way God does, and He values it highly. And I think He wants us to think of ourselves, and business people will relate to this, as we're part of His big supply chain. We're all connected. Everything we do has a cause and effect, and it can have a cause and effect for His kingdom. Your skill set is sharper today than it was 3 years ago, and your boss would agree. You're working as if it's a calling when you work that way. Your faith has made you more valuable at work, not less. That should be the Christian's goal, and it would be as they're living out business as a calling. You should have a reputation at work for being someone who sacrificially helps others succeed without needing any credit. You're a servant leader. And finally, if you're living out business as a calling, you would be involved in asking your leaders for help, holding you accountable, mentoring you, and you older folks would be mentoring younger people because I think it's important. It's the only way we can really live out business as a calling is with the help of others. I want to close with some encouragement from Esther. And I pick Esther because, of course, she's the Jewish princess who was captive to, or a servant under servitude at the Persian court. She was at the very bottom, and she probably had no hope that anything she could do would ever have any impact. And some of you may feel that way. You're just starting your career. You don't possibly have any idea what you could do. You also may have, like her, done some things you shouldn't have done. I mean, she lived a life of deception, right? Nobody knew she was Jewish. And we've all done things, but it didn't stop her from moving forward. And she recognized, after some training from her cousin, that she had a certain position in the palace for such a time as this. So how about you? You do too. You have a place in your business that nobody else occupies for such a time as this, and you can make a difference. So let me ask you again, what do? I think you're in full-time ministry. Why do you do it? I think you should do it for the glory of God. And are you called to it? And I believe you are. I believe you're called to right where you are until God calls you somewhere else. He's less interested in you getting into some perfect role than He is in how you and I, whether you and I are on His mission in the role we're in. As someone said, where you live doesn't make you a missionary, it's whether you're on the mission for God. Okay, let's switch gears. We have to understand business as a calling if we're going to be interested in business as mission. Let's talk about business as mission. I want to put it in the context of Mission of the World. For those that don't know much about Mission of the World, it's the mission sending agency of the PCA. We operate in over 80 countries. Church planning is the focus. Everything else we do, whether it's human trafficking, English second language, disaster response, medical ministry, street child ministry, or business's mission. It's all centered around helping church planting movements. We work practically solely through national indigenous pastors. The missionaries that we send from this country are there to identify, equip, mentor, train, encourage the national indigenous pastor. There are some exceptions where our people are being the pastor of a church, but not many. We work in the largest cities around the world and in the smallest villages around the world. We have over 600 missionaries from this country and over 1,200 national pastors or partners, and we send out about 5,000 short-term people a year. Church planting is the key to understanding our BAM, our Business as Mission Ministry, because it is integral with the church. Now, it's not easy for the church and the business people to cooperate on the mission field. Sometimes the church doesn't want the type A corporate business guy coming in and telling them what to do, right? Well, and business people don't want pastors trying to run businesses because most of them shouldn't. But we're committed to bridging that gap, and we're having some success. Business's mission has a rich history. You can look back to the Old and New Testament. You can look to people like the Apostle Paul and William Carey, who were both business people. Now, if we really fast forward to 1989 and especially 2004, at the Lausanne Conference on Evangelism, these are a gathering of worldwide leaders that are invited. Maximum number is 4,000. At least that was the number in 2010 that could come. And they're interdenominational, and it's a big conference on evangelism. At the one in 89 and 2004, a lot of attention was paid to BAM, Business's Mission, and out of that came a lot of working papers, and since then a lot of books and articles, and a lot of increased interest on vocational calling. In 2009, 11 mission agencies got together. Mission of the World was not one of them. Some of them, the names you would recognize, others are very small agencies. And they were asked, of all the missionaries you're going to send out from America around the world, what percentage will be business people doing business? And the answer was between 5 and 50%, which is really, even at the low end, an astonishing number. And in 2010, of the 4,000 people there, 400 of them were business people, where in the past it had only been theologians and pastors. So you can see it's got a rich history, and it's very much growing in interest. Same diagram. We talked about here in Augusta, the kind of ministries you can be involved in. Now let's talk about there overseas. You'll notice for us at Mission of the World, the church is in the center. That's different for most BAM ministries, but for us it is. You see the diagram that says trainers and mentors. Well, most business people here in our churches are going to become a trainer or mentor, and they're going to go overseas for a week at a time. They're going to use some of their travel dollars and their vacation time. And what are they going to do? Well, they're going to be involved in helping put on seminars for executives from large corporations. Or they're going to be involved in helping microenterprises start. What's a microenterprise? It's a 1 or 2 person company at most, usually in a rural village. Usually it's a woman trying to provide for her family. It may take $50. It may take at most $1,000 to capitalize that business. Great need there, great work being done there. We partner with a number of other people in that space, for instance, the Chalmers Center in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The third thing you might be involved in is small, medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. Most economists in the developing world believe that this is the key to the growth and prosperity of their economies. It's true for this country, too. Just some people don't get it. So we have a ministry to where you can go over to a center that's training entrepreneurs, and you can be a mentor for a week and help people start businesses. Those are the kinds of environments that if you were going to travel for a week that you would be involved in. I'm going to give you some specific examples of what people are doing in a minute. The bottom half of that is, well, what if I was going to go live overseas? And there are an increasingly number of people who are wanting to do this, young and old. And MTW has already recruited some and is looking for people to be business people who are business people who want to go be business people overseas. Some of them will be tent makers. They're pastors or pastor trained who want to or need to have a little business to contribute to help with the support requirements. That's occurring. Others are coaching entrepreneurs, and it is a wonderful experience, and it's important work. And we'll talk about that a little later. And we're looking for people to do that, and we will be looking for people to do that in a couple places in Africa later this year. Or you can be a BAM coordinator. You can go live overseas for a year or two or long term, and you can go to some part of the world to help our church planning team figure out, okay, well, in this context, what should BAM look like? What kind of business activity do we need that will help our church planning efforts, help transform the community for the gospel, give people jobs, and those kinds of things? So, if you're interested in moving over there, those are just 3 ways that you could get involved. Now, I said I wanted to give you some examples, and BAM is impossible to define. It has so many flavors. But I'm going to give you examples of what people in PCA churches around the United States are doing today. So either literally or figuratively, you close your eyes, and as you hear these, think about, okay, how has God designed me? Which of those could I do? Here we go. BAM is you presenting a subject you know well at a seminar in a major city in China for the purpose of making pre-evangelistic context for a local church. BAM is you mentoring for a week future entrepreneurs as they develop their business plan for a small, medium-sized enterprise, part of a 14-week training program. BAM is you providing a small amount of funding and or some time on Skype to nationals in Togo in West Africa who are themselves a small company who are in turn training the poorest of the poor in very rural villages to start a micro-enterprise. BAM is you who have just completed your BS or are involved in your MBA program, raising support and going for 6 to 12 months on a business internship as working alongside a church planning team in that training center, and what a great resume builder for your career. BAM is you, a young woman, going to Honduras, there's real needs, to take over the operation of a second-hand women's clothing store and helping local women start other very small businesses so these young women get out of or stay out of human trafficking and prostitution. Or it's a young woman going to doing similar kinds of things with a bag company, handbag company in Bangkok, Thailand, or a sewing operation in Huaraz, Peru. It's BAM is you second career types traveling overseas for a bit or even moving overseas for a period to help a MTW team develop a strategy for BAM in their context. BAM is you starting a farming operation in West Africa. Remember, these are all things that are being done or about to be done. You starting a farming operation in West Africa, a kingdom company, introducing Western farming techniques as a way of impacting the community, and on that same farm, this person is going to build a church, a medical clinic, and a school. BAM is this church placing on your missionary wall of fame. I don't know if you have one of those where you put the pictures of all your missionaries. Many churches do. But it's this church placing on your missionary wall of fame the picture of a young person who goes to work as a business person in some country, say for IBM, as part of a church planting team, instead of going to the small town or another part of Augusta to be part of a church planting team from this church, this young man or woman's going to go to some other country, be part of a church planting team. But they don't take a dime of support from you. But you still put them up on your missionary wall of fame and treat them as a missionary and pray for them. Or BAM is you as individuals or a church contributing as an angel investor to MTW's Business Incubator Fund, funding these kinds of initiatives around the world. So that's just a sample of what you could be doing in the future in 2013 and how you could be involved in business's mission. Why is there so much interest? One reason is access. Increasing are the number of countries that you cannot get into with a missionary visa. Or, if you can get in there, every 6 months you have to leave for 2 months well, that destroys your family life and it also destroys your ministry. So access is a big reason. We're committed to not having our missionaries be there, though, on a business visa as a ruse, one, because they'll be found out, and two, it lacks integrity. So we're committed to giving them platforms for being in there legitimately. But access to a business person is unrestricted. You can go to any country and produce an income or hire people. And so access is a big reason why BAM is of such interest. The other is funding. When we're able to help people get jobs, they get lifted out of poverty, their family is taken care of, they have money to give to their church. Over the long term, their church becomes self-sustaining, and that's a good thing. In a couple of cases, these businesses are producing profits which stay in the country, in the ministry, and support other ministries. So funding is another important reason why this is going, why this interest is increasing. Third one is effectiveness. We've seen business people in certain cities have a great witness to other business people in those cities. I suspect many of you were brought to faith if, like me, you came as an adult through another business person that maybe you worked with or somebody in your neighborhood. So you understand how effective that can be. And so as business people are deployed in these cities or these areas around the world, they have an effective witness. Also, where we are able to talk about our training center, our church work is getting great credibility because they look at the investment we've made in them starting a business and they think, wow, these people really care about all of me, not just my soul. The last reason it's growing in interest is because people like you in our churches who are business people want to use your gifts. You can do evangelism, you can do construction, but you say to yourself, I'd like to use my business gifts or business skills. And so as your denominational agency, we're trying to help serve you and give you ways to use those gifts. And that's happening all across the country. I mentioned to Mike, this is my 4th week in a row I'm giving one of these. And it isn't because of me, it's because of the subject. So this is a hot topic, and we're excited to be a part of it. So how do you get started? Well, pray. And you got to think outside the box. All of us are trained to think that missions is pastoral, seminary trained missionaries going out and doing their thing. And missions committees and pastors don't think like this always. Obviously, you all do. But you got to think outside the box. You might want to establish on your missions committee a BAM coordinator or in your presbytery, somebody who can look into this, research, develop strategies, talk with other people, take a small team to some part of the world that you're fully engaged in, scout out what's going on, what could happen there from a BAM perspective. I'm taking 2 business people, 2 retired business executives with me to West Africa in April because the national churches there in 3 countries, there's about 150 churches. Their pastors need to be supported. Their churches need to continue to grow. They need to plant more churches. They want to be self-sustaining. Also, they know money from the U.S. isn't what it used to be. So they've asked us to come over there, and you can go to these places and you can figure out, well, how could we help them? What would the businesses look like that could fund ministry there? The other thing you might want to do is, you know how some cities have sister cities in other parts of the world? Well, this church should adopt a sister city and commit yourself over the next 20 or 30 years to having a meaningful impact with the gospel on the business community in that city. Finally, or maybe you should start here and ask your missionaries, how could you help them in this area of business's mission? But as you do, don't be surprised if they say, what? This is new. First. Secondly, they got their hands full. So some are more needing it, where there's an access issue. For some, it's just, okay, we'll get to that. But I would encourage you to reach out to those missionaries you love and ask them how you can get involved. Why would you want to get involved? Well, for the sake of the gospel and the glory of God, or we shouldn't be doing it. For the sake of the world. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and the Chinese and lots of other foundations are pouring all kind of money, for instance, into Africa. And those economies and those businesses are going to be one day flourishing. We think of Africa sometimes as helpless, but it's not. It's on the move, not just with Christianity, but economically as well. It's got a long way to go, but it's on the move. But guess what? Those businesses and those economies are going to be devoid of Christ. So shame on us Christian business people in America if we let that happen. Finally, for your sake, you should get involved because God's designed you to be a business person. You have gifts and abilities. You're a problem solver. You take initiative. You know how to get things done. The church needs you. What better way could you be involved in using your gifts than for the global church around the world? We started with the Apostle Peter and a call to stewardship. This guy's almost an apostle, John Bunyan. And he says, I begin to see that the Holy Spirit never intended that people who had gifts and abilities should bury them in the earth, but rather he commanded and stirred up such people to exercise their gifts and sent them out to work, those who were able and ready. I hope you do so. I'm around the next couple of days. If you want to quickly write that down, I'd be happy to try and get together with you and talk with you individually about your interest or undo some of the confusing things I'm sure I have said. Thank you very much for the privilege of being here.